you mention it, yeah.
Now that you mention it. Mention it. Mention it.
Yeah.
Now you mention it. Yeah.
Now that you mention it. Mention it. Mention it.
Yeah.
We are recording again.
Yo, again.
What up, Kevin?
What's poppin'?
Welcome to the Now That You Mention It podcast. This is potential episode number.
Who knows?
This might come out. I'm going to say this is probably going to come out third. I'm going to say this will be the third one.
Okay.
We have an opening. Oh, wait. So today we are talking about what a classic album is.
Right.
What makes a classic is our central question, is our main topic. But you have an opening segment?
Just a quick shout out.
Go ahead.
Shout out to Tinashe.
Stop.
Yeah, she's fire.
I want to shout out to Tinashe.
Too late.
Fuck.
What's up, Tinashe?
Have you
You're fire.
listened to a Tinashe song? Start to end. The whole thing. Have you listened to a Tinashe song?
Yes. I can't tell you what the song is though.
Can you tell me what it sounded like? I'm at the point where I don't even know what genre of music she makes. I could guess, but
It's poppy. It's poppy, like, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the best way to describe it. I mean, she makes like a lot of like pop festival like music.
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Why is
and
it?
then the reason why I kind of dig Tinashe too is because she's like, she at least does all the shit herself. You know what I'm saying? Like, she's like writing, she's producing.
I didn't know that at all.
Yeah, so she's pretty fire for that.
Why is she not more popular, or is it just I'm ignorant?
I don't know. Might be ignorant because she's just probably. I mean, you got to think about like who we listen to, you know. So like, we're like focused on a certain genre.
Yeah, but
in a
neither of
sense.
us listen to Cardi B or Ariana Grande, but I feel like those
right,
are totally
but they're always like. So Cardi B is a fucking rapper, you know, for whatever that's worth.
yeah.
So obviously we're gonna know about Cardi B. Ariana Grande is either on a song with a rapper or fucking with a rapper. So we're gonna, know what's going on with her
Right.
in that sense.
So who's a contemporary of Tinashe, or who's a
It would probably be like an Ariana Grande.
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
But yeah, she's
She's
dumb.
massively fire.
she's massively fire. I have an opening segment that maybe we don't have to get to. I want to just intro the opening segment, which is white dudes who have some kind of identity wrapped up in hip hop who go up on the Breakfast Club, who then have to, like, in some OD corny way, prove how down they are by, like, talking about how much Tupac they used to listen to when they were 7.
Is this your Jonah Hill rant?
This is Jonah Hill is a classic example of this, but these cases are wide ranging, and they invariably, if you click on Breakfast Club YouTube page or Sway or anyone, and it's some white cat up there for whatever reason to promo whatever, invariably within the first 10 minutes, if they don't talk about how much Biggie they grew up on,
That's true.
it's cringe. It's cringe-worthy.
That's true.
Yeah, I think that might be an episode or a full-fledged opening segment about just like white people just being extra and then it making my skin crawl, because like, can't you just be normal?
No,
my mom, when I was pregnant, my mom put fucking
right. Well, when his mom was pregnant.
yeah, is that what I said? I the first thing I heard was "Ready to Die." Like, shut up.
Yeah,
We get it. You can just
right.
like hip hop. You don't have to OD. Like,
Right.
you have to fucking
there's
prove yourself.
Yeah, I was just about to say, there's like an overcompensation of like trying to sound like you know what you're talking about, trying to be sort of in the group, in the crew, so to speak.
It's just like the most like it's just Hillary with the hot sauce, but we
the hot
like
sauce so out of context.
No, I went back and watched that just to actually examine how insane that was.
Bro, that was the worst shit.
Oh my god, skin crawling.
Yeah.
Skin crawling.
Yeah.
Oh, awful.
Yeah. And then Hillary Clinton's an awful person.
All right. How do we want to dive into classics?
Well, I mean, we have a central question. What makes a classic album?
You know, I want the answer to be a classic album has to do with the merits of the music itself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if it's a masterfully produced album with qualities that, you know, with outstanding X, Y, and Z, however you want to quantify it or classify it, that makes it a classic. But I think the unfortunate, or not, maybe not unfortunate, but the conclusion I came to is that a classic is what people say is a classic. A classic is what gets canonized as a classic.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
I agree. I think the larger question is sort of who determines what a classic is, right? So like, is it the fans, like, or is it, you know, is it the media? Like, who determines what a classic is? Like, what's the criteria for a classic? Like, can you just hear something and know, like, oh, this is a classic? Or is it something that you have to, like, really sort of judge against a rubric or something, right? So I know, like, one of the articles we read for this episode talked about, like, the criteria for a classic album.
Was that the Kendrick Lamar Drake and the definition of a classic?
Yeah, where it was talking about, like, coherence, impact, and replayability.
Yep.
And I guess that could be grounds for a classic, or at least the most basic sort of criteria for a classic. But I don't know. I think that it's definitely more than that to me. There's like elements of like craftsmanship and experimentation that have to like go into play for me.
Okay, well, maybe we should just start by reading a definition of classic from the dictionary. And so, definition of classic reads as follows: serving as a standard of excellence, of recognized value, a classic literary work, or traditional, like enduring classic designs, or historically memorable, like a classic battle.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting because depending on which definition, or both definitions are like contained within the word, but you either have a definition that appeals more to the quality of the work itself, and then you have a definition that appeals more to how history remembers a certain moment. Right. So I don't know, with albums it's hard because I think like now that the internet is a thing, like I'm not articulate enough to, now that the internet is fucking the internet, like it's just regular, like everyone, like you can, like I'm just thinking about like how siloed you can be in terms of like every artist has like a little community that goes with it, and like you can sort of pick and choose so much what you want to listen to, what you identify with, and what you ultimately consider a classic. Whereas back, I think it was just like a more democratized landscape, or if that makes sense, back before the internet, where an album came out and everyone listened to that shit.
Well, I think that you might have the terms mixed up though. I think that it might be more democratic in terms of people having the ability to put out their own music and shit like that and create their own sort of followings around that. Whereas back in the day, you had more gatekeepers. And so, and I think that based on that, you had a lot of, again, it goes back to my thing about craftsmanship. Like you had a more focus. You were more focused on sort of crafting something that would stand the test of time under, you know, a label or whatever. Versus now, people are just putting out shit, and so that same level of like, of, you know, craftsmanship that's been, you know, put in a lot of records, you know, in the past, just don't have that same like type of quality today. And so I think that a lot of it has to do with like, I think a lot of it has to do now with like the impact, like how did, like, does a certain work sort of like shift the paradigm in a sense, you know what I'm saying? Like, does it change the sound or change the landscape in any type of way? So yeah, I think that's how we could maybe judge a classic in terms of today's landscape with the internet versus back in the day where, you know, like you said, like it was what was out, and it was kind of like you had to live with that or whatever. And
yeah, and I mean, I guess I would clarify by saying that not everything was a classic just by virtue of it being out. There's lots of music that is not considered classic from the golden age or from like the second golden age or whatever,
right.
Like the 90s in New York and hip hop, like where cats were sharing CDs and buying tapes on the street and whatever. But like a lot of that music we don't talk about in the same reverence that we talk about Nas and Jay's first album. So like there is something to, I guess, having less like a less crowded field, right? So it's like there was just more, it was more easily, a consensus, I guess, was more easily arrived at back then, where now you have people, I mean, like I'm guilty of it too. Like I have my little niche rappers and artists that I like that I'm like, no, this is a classic.
Right.
But it's like, is it really?
Yeah.
So I mean.
And I'm like that too. Because I kind of wrote a couple down that like I know for me are like personal classics.
Well,
but
we're going to get to that term. Is personal classic an oxymoron? Like,
yeah.
Does personal classic make sense?
Nah,
okay.
Not really. And it's not even really, okay, you could say personal or you could say cult. A cult classic.
I think a cult classic is
probably
maybe the more accurate description of what you're talking about. Okay, but list off a couple of these because we can just get to this.
So I know, like, for one, I think an excellent cult classic of recent memory is The Sun's Tirade.
Is that a cult classic?
I think so.
I feel like Sylvia Demo might be more of a cult classic than Sun's Tirade. Plus, I think Sylvia Demo is better. But we can have this can be a side debate.
That could be a debate. I love Sylvia Demo, but
Sylvia Demo was on some other shit.
It was.
I'm sorry to say for Isaiah, but
I think the only reason why I give the nod to The Sun's Tirade is, I guess, like the cohesiveness of that project was like, I really didn't feel like a lull in the project at all. And so I think that that's important in determining like what a classic, you know, sounds like.
Okay, interesting. So that's really interesting because when I think of cult classic in terms of it, like in the hip hop world, Sun's Tirade would not be the first that comes to mind by a long shot. Like I would think of something more like Earl Sweatshirt's first mixtape or Dom Kennedy's Yellow album mixtape. Or even like the Wiz Khalifa joint, the Cushion OJ, where it like had more.
And so and that's interesting too, and that's something that I guess we're gonna have to like also maybe tack down. Is like, is there a difference between an album and a mixtape?
I don't. Now I don't.
Because if we were going to mixtapes, because that's why I said The Sun's Tirade. That's an official like studio album. Yep. But yeah, if we were going to like mixtapes, then definitely it's like, I mean, yeah, I guess you could say Yellow album for Dom, West Side With Love 2 is super fucking fire. And I'm biased because I'm a Dom fan, but like,
yeah,
that would be like a cult classic. yeah, the album. I guess we really don't need to distinguish between them.
Well,
like
maybe that's. I guess maybe when we think about it, the cult classic might be the correlate to cult classic in the hip hop world might just be the classic mixtape. Versus like the classic classic might just be the classic studio album, right?
Right. Okay, that's fine.
Because I mean, I'm just thinking. I always hear cult classic thrown around in terms talking about movies,
yeah.
right? And I feel like the cult classics are kind of like indie directors, like maybe a little underground vibe, but
lower budget,
right? And so I think we do with classic mixtapes. There is like this category that cats have when it comes. Oh, that's a classic mixtape. So maybe our criteria. Is slightly different for what makes a classic mixtape, where it's more about the moment that
I was just about to say. So is it like with the classic mixtape, would that be more so classic in terms of the impact of that mixtape when it's like, let's say when it drops or whatever, and it sort of captures that moment, whereas a classic studio album is more like fine wine in a sense. It's just, as it ages, because I mean a lot of people, I guess you could still, I guess that's part of it, is the replayability of the mixtape as well, as you go back and fuck with it, but the studio album is definitely like the more polished work that sort of stands the test of time, right? So like it's something that I would think that I'm trying to think who has like a mixtape and a classic album. So like Section 80, right, would be considered a classic mixtape from Kendrick, right?
Is that a mixtape though?
Yeah.
I always thought it was a mixtape, but then I heard someone say that was Kendrick's debut on a major.
It was a mixtape.
It was a mixtape. Yeah, okay. All right, whatever. Forget that. It's a mixtape. Yeah.
But and so you hear Section 80, which is absolute fire. Mm-hmm. But there's like a polished element to Good Kid, Mad City that isn't in that same sort of raw, just here, we're in this moment, we're creating this and we're putting it out. There's like a certain sort of polished vibe with Good Kid, Mad City that I think is the distinguishing factor between like the cult classic mixtape and the classic studio album.
Yeah, I think you're dead on. I'm just thinking of, my brain is just rushing to like counter examples for that, where sometimes I'm taking the mixtape as the better, more cohesive piece of art, and maybe not polished. And then it's like, what is polished, really?
So I think the polished element, I think Nipsey talked about it. Rest in peace to a real one. I think he talked about it in terms of Victory Lap. So like Crenshaw, I think is his best project overall, right? Even though I'm more sentimental toward the Marathon, just personally, but Crenshaw is his best. I think is his best body of work, right?
Is Crenshaw the mix? Is that 2013? Is that the mixtape that has Ocean Views on it? No, is that Slauson?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Crenshaw is the red cover.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So in terms of that, like, I think the Crenshaw mixtape is probably his best work, his best body of work overall. Mm-hmm. But you can hear the polishedness of if that's a word, from Victory Lap, right? There's like, it's actually been, mixed and mastered, and certain, just it's a lot of like technical shit that's involved with the studio album that funds just permit you to do that the mixtape disallows, right?
Yeah, but I guess I'm just pushing back on the idea that those things that a bigger budget brings necessarily mean more replayability or more.
Oh, no. I'm not making the claim that it, that makes it any better or anything like that. It's just it's it's just another step that you're allowed to take to create. So like, it, you know, as writers, like if we're writing some shit and we write an essay or something, and the first draft is fire, you know what I'm saying? It's pretty cool. Like people can get the point and everything like that, and it could be like a legit piece. Yeah, we put that out there and cats will fuck with it. But it's something else about like, okay, now I have a master's thesis, and so now I have to edit it. I have to, you know, make sure, you know, all my sources are. It's just a different sort of process that I think is involved with, like, I think the mixtape is maybe more organic in that sense, whereas you are trying to create a classic, I think, or you should be when you're making a studio album.
Okay, that makes sense. I think that's perfectly said. But yeah, I do think there are we have slightly different criteria when I think evaluating the classic mixtape. But okay, so some other questions like germane to what actually just makes something classic. My thing when talking about a classic album, because you have classic movies which I guess are made up of constituent parts, but it's really easy. It's much easier to conceptualize of a movie as just like one piece, one thing. Whereas an album is a collection of songs. So what is the relationship of the parts to the whole in terms of a classic? And I guess it like another way of saying that would be, can there be songs that you don't like on a classic? Does each song have to be a classic song on an album? It doesn't have to be a classic song, but like, what is the relationship of the parts to the whole on an album?
It depends. It depends on like what you privilege, right? Do you privilege like storytelling and like a cohesive story, right? Because you have albums that tell a story that are, you know, almost cinematic, right? Like going back to your film example. And so if you are one who sort of privileges this like track 1 through 14, you know, we're telling this particular type of story. It's a, you know, an entire concept, and each song adds to that overall concept, despite whether or not you fuck with that particular song. As long as you understand that song as being an important element of the entire concept of the project, I think you can still be like, okay, that's a classic album, even though I don't fuck with, you know, song 5 and 9 or whatever, but the rest of them I fuck with. I think you can still be like, oh, that's a classic album. Yeah,
but I think that's because you are vibrating on a higher frequency than most cats when it comes to evaluating this shit, where it's like, I hear a lot of people say a classic album can't have any songs that you want to skip, whereas yours more valuing the narrative and in terms of the overall construction of the piece of work. And it's also, you're kind of, I think in 2019, I might be a little generous to assume that every artist is conceiving of the album as a cohesive piece of work, instead of a collection of 10 to 12 to
right,
especially with these double album motherfuckers.
Oh yeah, that's
it's a ploy. Like I can't, like no amount of argument is gonna convince me that fucking Drake Scorpion is not just a collection of songs that Drake had in the tux and just like rattled off and shit. Like, come on.
Yeah. And I think that like that's why not everybody puts out a classic though, right? Is because it's like it's not, you know, everybody's not putting the same level of thought into like what the project eventually becomes. And so I think because people are going into it like, yo, I'm trying to get a track from Mustard, I'm trying to get a track from Metro Boomin and this and that, and you just jam some shit together
and you're just hoping something sticks.
And you're hoping it sticks. Yeah. I mean, you might have a good album, you know, or rather like a good playlist, you know, but in terms of like it being a cohesive body of work, like as an album, no, I wouldn't even say that. Like, so yeah, I'm not really giving people credit, more so than I'm like hardlining. If it doesn't meet this sort of requirement as an album, if it's playing to me like a playlist, then yeah, that's pretty cool. But I can make my own fucking playlist. You know what I'm saying? In terms of just picking random songs and putting them together and like, yo, I'm vibing out to this. If I'm listening to an album that I consider to be classic, it has to have like some type of narrative that I'm like sitting there and I'm taking something away from. I don't think that I can really deem something a classic that doesn't do that.
That's not cohesive. Just
Right.
to like tack it down.
Yeah.
Okay. So far we've got cohesiveness is a requirement.
Is a requirement. For sure.
Okay. So do you want? I think maybe it would be best to get into other requirements of classics, which is the technical proficiency element. What do you think that a classic must display, like technical proficiency, like masterful technical proficiency in terms of the musicianship or the whatever?
Yeah. I think that might be like the most important part, really. Versus like, I think the cohesion and shit comes later. I think if it's like fire music, you know what I'm saying? Like that's sort of the first thing that you have to have is like dope shit. Otherwise, I mean, you can have a good story or whatever, or you know, or you can rap really good, but the music is trash. You know what I'm saying? Like,
I guess the reason I push back on this one, or not, I don't push back on it. Like, I'm totally like a fucking, I don't know, like antiquated motherfucker that's like, no, the art needs to be good first. But like, this argument depends on the idea that art can be evaluated objectively. And so in the back of my mind this whole time as we're having this discussion, I'm just like, okay, so what do you do with the gangs of people that are just such and such is classic? Drake has 12 classics, blah, 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 blah. It's like, what do you do when just the consensus amongst people is that it's a classic? When something is a classic, or not even classic, just that something is good.
what do you do?
If we're making this argument, which depends on the assumption that art can be evaluated objectively, but then you have
what would I do?
I mean I guess how do you square those two things? It's like if we're saying that a classic needs a certain amount of technical proficiency and cohesion, but then everyone out there is saying, nah, this is a classic. Views is a classic, or So Far Gone is a classic, or whatever, to use the Drake example. But then we evaluate it as, wait, there's not really cohesion and there's not really technical proficiency, so what are you motherfuckers talking about? But like the general consensus, the overwhelming consensus is, no, this is a classic. I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm just...
No, and I think for that, I think for a situation like that, you just use better judgment. I think that's the answer to that. Like, yeah, it's a lot of shit that people deem a classic rather, that isn't. And so you have to be able to evaluate that. Yeah, like Drake doesn't have a classic.
No.
You know? And so for people who say Drake has a classic, I think more than me reevaluating like Drake's catalog in terms of like, oh, well, the consensus is Drake has X amount of classics or whatever, maybe I should like sort of reevaluate my take on it. I'm like, why do you think that Drake has a classic? So if now, again, like you're gonna have to come with some type of criteria, you know? And so what, you know, if that criteria is, oh, you know, I turn it on and, you know, I'm instantly, you know, turned up and whatever, then if that's your, you know, if that's your definition, or if that's your criteria, then okay, then that's what it is, and I just see where you're at. But that's not gonna like influence how I judge albums or anything like that. No.
Okay. All right. I guess I'm just wary because it seems just so dependent on like the whole idea of what gets canonized and what gets remembered in terms of culture. It just seems like, especially nowadays, it's like...
But what has been like... That's the thing though. It's like what has been deemed a classic now. And I mean, of course you have like people who have their like artists who have their own like sort of fan base and shit like that. And so of course they're gonna think, you know, Drake drops whatever, it's a classic, instant right? Classic. For Drake fans. But I think when we're talking about classics in terms of like just real, just straight to the point hip hop type shit, like I still think that I still think that the albums that are canonized for the most part deserve it. You know what I'm saying? Because there's like it, especially in this landscape, because there's a consensus. So like for a Good Kid in the age of streaming to be this sort of, you know, undeniable classic from everyone, right, is like that's telling of like what this album is on not only like the most basic level for like everybody to be like, oh, I fuck with it and this is the classic, to like the more, you know, nuanced thinkers who are like, oh, I'm, you know, trying to pick out these different elements or whatever and see if it sort of, you know, meets the standards in that sense. So yeah, I think like what you're getting at is this idea that like because the general public sort of determines how things are canonized, and because we live in this, you know, this era of whatever type of music, that now like whatever is going to be canonized as a classic. And I just don't think that that's the case, because I don't think a lot of cats are making music to be classics. You know what I'm saying? Like you can't like,
yeah, okay. And I agree with you 100%. I'm really just pushing back against my own, what I want to be true. And it's like, I feel like the people who think more about it are just, I guess the older cats really depend on this. The older cats who don't fuck with the new shit are really pushing the narrative, or really hoping or relying on or whatever. Like this music that they criticize and critique, they're always like, nah, they're not going to be playing this 10 years from now, or like this isn't going to stand the test of time the way Reasonable Doubt stands the test of time, because it's like popcorn, it's microwave, they made it in 2 seconds or whatever. But it's like, well, the 17-year-old that's listening to Lil Xan and Kodak Black or whatever, they might be playing it 10 years from now. So like,
yeah, but I mean, we aren't playing like, what's the shit? Laffy Taffy and all the Snap music and shit, and that came out when we were teenagers.
That's true.
So I think that the music that eventually gets canonized is like legitimate in a sense. I mean, there's obviously going to be some questionable, you know, albums and shit like that, but I think for the most part, the shit that's canonized more times than not deserves the distinction.
Do you think, and this is like should be posed as a question to myself, because do you think that there's any albums that the general population or the general consensus has gotten wrong in terms of getting sort of canonized or classified as a classic?
I'm sure it is, yeah. I don't know any off the top of my head. I would have to like really think about it, but for sure, I'm sure it is. Yeah. Because I mean, yeah, like it might be the artist, you know what I'm saying, their persona, or it might be a lot of just different factors around some shit. It might be a moment, you know, it might represent that. Because I think like another thing with like classic albums, and something that we have to like add into there somehow, is like the nostalgic factor of it, you know, and that kind of goes in terms of like the aging of that album, like how well it ages, and then that nostalgia that's associated with it. And so I think like a lot of albums that may lack some of the like technical proficiencies may have captured just a moment sonically that now it's like when you hear that, you're in a, you know, you're back in that moment and everything like that. It's, you know, it's aged well, so you're willing to say, okay, yeah, this is a classic, but it might have an asterisk by it, you know what I'm saying, because it doesn't, meet every single standard like that. So I think it's shit like that that's out there that's considered a classic.
No, sorry, I was all over the place with that, with my shit. But okay, so can a classic sound dated?
I don't know, and that's a good question.
This is what kind of fucks me up too, because just being into music, it's like I have gone back and listened to the shit that came before, and it's like Run DMC is hard for me to listen to, man.
Yeah.
And the more I know about the landscape out of which it came and the time period and the context, that's all good, and I can understand and appreciate Run DMC's place in the lineage of hip-hop. But to me and my ear, that sound is just difficult for me to listen to.
Yeah. I think about that.
And so at what point do I have to just submit to, oh no, Raising Hell's a classic, versus it was an important moment and it led to X, Y, and Z, and it's a place in hip hop history, but it's not a classic.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
I guess this whole time what I'm driving at is how much does an individual's personal taste factor into classic? Like the push and pull between this
Something
is how it's
like.
remembered and the forces of history, and like this is how it's going to be written about and remembered, versus whether or not I actually fuck with it.
Yeah, and I think you reserve that right, because I think like you look at like fine art and shit, or like there's a lot of classic books that are kind of trash, and so I think in those instances it might be more so like understanding the context, understanding everything sort of around it, in order for you to really appreciate it. But I don't know if you would. I don't know if you have to necessarily like something or personally feel like, okay, this is, this shit is a classic. Because I don't think everything is. I don't think all music is timeless. Obviously, you know. So the distinction that that timeless distinction that like a Reasonable Doubt gets, or Illmatic or something like that, is rare. That's like super rare. So for Run DMC, I think you can say like, yeah, like that's a classic, in the sense of, and then that's like where we have to go in terms of like the definitions of classic, in terms of like, here's something that you sort of understand for its, technical proficiency, its, sonic appeal, blah, 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 or whatever, versus like the more historical, contextual approach to it. So yeah, I think you can say that like, yeah, that's a classic, but I personally don't, fuck with it. Like, Thriller is a classic, right? I personally like Off the Wall better,
I think Off the Wall is a classic too, though.
It's a classic, but I'm
yeah.
just saying, I personally, like, you won't like go through my phone and see like the last Michael Jackson song I played was off of Thriller.
Yeah.
More than likely it'll be Off the Wall, especially the title track, Off the Wall, is super fire.
Mm-hmm.
But so like, yeah, but I can still recognize obviously that Thriller is this groundbreaking album, everything like that, and so yeah, it deserves that classic distinction.
Yeah, just the can an album sound dated question kind of fucks me up too, because it's like the Run DMC and even like Fat Boys and some Public Enemy, it's just hard for me. Just the way that back then, like the time, like the rhythm of that era, like was just really blocky and stacked on top of each other, and it was just like really mechanical. Like, I mean, even think about like how
well, that's how PE like produced, you know what I'm saying, like the Bomb Squad, like deliberately, it's like we were making this shit chaotic as fuck, and so yeah, I think like you have to like, I think something can be dated. I definitely think something can be dated, and you being able to understand why it's considered a classic You know what I'm saying? Like, versus, okay, it has to, I have to just fuck with it in order for it to be a classic. Like, on a personal level, before I can then, sort of appeal to the consensus thinking on it. Yeah, I think you can definitely just be like, I don't really fuck with that, but I appreciate it and know what it is.
Yeah, it's just crazy because I then get into like my jazz shit where I listen to the music of Thelonious Monk or John Coltrane or Joe Henderson or whoever from the 60s and 50s, and it's like that shit hits me. Mm-hmm. And so it's just like a weird, this is more getting into I think something else, which is just like I guess a more technical discussion of music and like how time feel has evolved. But yeah, it just fucks me up because I go and listen to A Love Supreme, to name the big one, which is from 1965, and it's like that shit hits. But okay, so is All Eyes on Me a classic?
Yeah, it's a classic.
Why?
I think going back to like, well, it has like some, some of Pac's like seminal tracks on it.
Okay.
And then also I think All Eyes on Me was the best sort of snapshot of that death row era, right?
Yeah.
And so I think like in terms of like appreciating it for that as like this, again, like going back to that nostalgia of like this puts you in a particular type of space, right? I think for All Eyes on Me, like what it lacks in cohesion, I think it makes up for in like impact.
So that's what I was getting at. This note I have under my heading of cultural impact definition of classic. So this is another one that kind of it doesn't necessarily strike me as it doesn't necessarily logically follow in my head, where if an album shifts the paradigm a little or changes the trajectory of hip-hop sound, then it's a classic. Like, does that how much does that weigh in terms of calling an album a classic or not?
I think that comes after. The more important shit, which is the musicality and the cohesion associated with the project. But yeah, like the impact, I think, is after that. I think the impact comes after that. So like it's a tertiary, standard.
Because like, does Good Kid, Mad City, like, what impact has that had other than it just being a dope album? What's the impact of an album like Good Kid, Mad City, as opposed to, I guess, a more paradigm shifting album like 808s and Heartbreak, or like a Kid Cudi, or
right. So like I have in my notes like about like the cohesion, impact, and replayability. I asked like, does a classic like need to incorporate each of those elements equally, or is it just sort of how it all shapes out? And so like for me, for like a Good Kid, I even have it down here, like even for like Good Kid, I think it shifted the attention back to the West Coast in a way.
Yeah, you're right.
And so what followed after that, like you got the YGs and you got the Nips and everything like that sort of come out with projects after that are accepted in a different way, and the stories that are associated with it. Because I think like you look back to like West Coast shit, like before that you had Game, who was running shit on the West, and his albums, I think in terms of like saying if something's a classic, that may not have like this sort of narrative, this explicit narrative tied to it, but it's just a bunch of dope ass songs.
Documentary.
Yeah. Like shit like that. So you had that, you go back to Snoop and them like that. And a lot of it was like, we're creating music through this particular sound, and we may incorporate like what's going on and shit, you know, in LA or wherever. But I think with Good Kid, Mad City, it was like, here's this concept of, you know, in this particular place at this particular time, and that music takes you there. And I think in that sense, it not only like its impact, not only like what it had on what it did for just that album, but then like I said, it shifted the attention back to the West Coast, to where now you had cats who were like, now we're not just making songs, we're like telling stories. YG's first album was a story. Like Nip's projects are normally like, you know, Mailbox Money was kind of shaky, but like Crenshaw told a story, you know what I'm saying? The Marathon told a story. Like, so it's, I think
so that's more cultural impact than it is like shifting
like
the
sound.
Okay.
I think Good Kid like sort of picked up the mantle of like the West Coast sound with, you know, with that, versus like To Pimp a Butterfly attempted to change the sound with that, like going back to like the 70s funk era and shit like that with a lot of that music. And so I definitely think Good Kid was just like a culture shifter.
Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe what I'm coming to is that a classic album is one that just makes the listener play by its rules. So you have an album like Liquid Swords, Jizza, where the lyrical proficiency is, I don't know,
out of this world.
That might be like the platonic ideal form of like lyricism, right? I don't know how much more lyrical you can get than that. And so it's a classic for that reason. But I'm trying to think of something on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of its all cultural impact, and it's a classic for that reason. And then you have the in-betweens, where it was a big cultural moment, and it displayed a lot of technical proficiency, was cohesive, but it's so like you can kind of arrive at it's a classic for a bunch of different reasons, so long as the work itself sort of plays by those rules, right? Okay. Like if there are no, you know, like art and like storytelling and stuff like that, you're like kind of writing the rules as you go along, right? In creating shit. So as long as the work doesn't violate its own rules, like Liquid Swords wouldn't be a classic if the first 5 songs were Liquid Swords and then, you know, it turned into fucking Kid and Play,
right?
Like, you know, like right. It wouldn't be a classic, but so it doesn't really violate its own expectations, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. I don't know. That's kind of what I'm at now.
So I think like, damn, like, cause I don't know if I wouldn't say culturally, I wouldn't say this probably doesn't answer your question culturally, but sonically, 808s, right? Like 808s is like this sort of just paradigm shifter, like, you know, in its truest form, basically. Like it literally ushered in an entire, you know, subgenre of hip hop. And so I think like off the strength of what you hear, the cats you hear, you know, the melodies, the you know, throwback 80s, you know, influence and everything like that, is clear sign that 808s is a classic. Culturally though, I'm still having a difficult time thinking of like something that was just like super like cultural impact that kind of didn't measure up otherwise. I don't know.
I don't know. I know that I feel like My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy is like the perfect middle ground where it's like the production is sick.
No,
and
that's
it's a masterpiece, but it also had that cultural.
Yeah, that's experimentation and that's experimentation and execution meets execution, like for real, like in a way that I don't think an album has done since.
Hell
know,
no.
like
hell no.
Yeah, he was on some other shit with that.
Yeah.
Damn. I mean, can something like just be sort of culturally significant in that sense and sort of lack the sonic?
How can we not think of shit that's been huge, but then it might still be a classic, but it just doesn't have that.
But that's what I'm saying. Like, are we not able to think of something like that because it's not considered a classic? You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. Can't go to J.
Nah. Yeah, that one's tough. That one's tough. Because it would have to be like some sort of like musical element that's.
What about The Chronic? What about something like that where it's not OD displays of technicality?
Well, then.
But it just culturally was insane.
But the technicality wasn't Dre. Lyrically, the technicality was Dre through his production. Mm-hmm. And so, I think like for The Chronic, like The Chronic has like a interesting spot like in hip hop history because it's like this sort of apex of that West Coast sound in terms of like it capturing LA in the early 90s, yet that was like the shift to the mainstream, you know, with The Chronic. So I know like it definitely had like, it's definitely on that cultural spectrum, but I think what Dre, you know, because Dre's not a rapper, and so I think what you go to The Chronic for to really like get into it is the production and like where that places you. And so that would just be my pushback on that one, is I think like his technicality is coming through just a different medium.
What about DMX?
Ooh.
He had a style. And the Rough Riders wave or like the Diplomats wave. My New York bias is coming out, but it's like super good rappers, but they're not ODing, and super good production, but it's not. It was just the wave.
Fucking the Heat Makers, bro. That early Dipset shit. Me and my boy were just talking about it. Like that. Come Home With Me. The Diplomatic Immunity. Fucking From Me to You. Jewels. Like, man. Like, that's some. Yeah.
So let's go DMX.
Okay.
DMX's, let's say, first two albums. He was bringing like a rawness. I guess it wasn't like he's bringing it back because that was 98. So it's like it's not like it's that far like in the memory that, you know, Mobb Deep was coming, but I guess it's like what's the standout element that made DMX and the whole Rough Riders wave just so crazy?
I mean, I think what Swiss was able to do sonically was to sort of match, like, he created a sound around the idea of what like the Rough Riders were. So like you had like that gritty, you know what I'm saying? Like we out here on these fucking bikes.
And that's why I'm saying it's more of
the cultural.
It's the cultural bomb.
Yeah. Okay, I can see that. I can kind of see that for sure. And I mean, yeah, because I don't think that it's like, in me saying that, I'm not discounting X as an artist in that, but yeah, I do think like the culture around that whole Rough Riders movement is what ballooned that shit, you know, made it turn into what it eventually became. Because yeah, like that was a movement, like for real, like that was a fucking movement. So yeah, when it's like movements like that, sort of crews having shit or whatever, it's kind of like interesting to see like how you judge like albums like that within that context.
Because I feel like Wu-Tang was the same, but they had the virtuosity to go with it, the lyrical virtuosity and the production virtuosity mixed with the whole cultural wave. And like then it's like now I'm kind of even more bugged out because it's like now it's like how much does like the marketing campaign and like the image and the persona have to do with like the cultural impact, which then translates into the classic.
Yeah, and that's a lot of. I think that's a lot of it. That's always been a lot, you know, because again, like I can go back to the Thriller shit, right? Like they marketed the fuck out of Thriller, right? And it could have, you know, and it probably would have still been a classic album on its own, but yeah, the marketing behind it is definitely like that. Definitely took it to like a global stage in a way that, you know, no album really has ever matched since. So yeah, that's definitely part of it, especially now. Like I think more so now than before, for sure, because I think that's most of like, I think the cultural element or the lifestyle element associated with certain artists is more important today. So you kind of get, and that's where most of the like the Drake shit comes from. Is like Drake Drake drops bangers and shit, but the overall sort of hype around Drake is Drake embodies like this rapper as this, you know, as this all-world celebrity or whatever, and that, you know, influences how you know, judge his work. So yeah, I think today is like definitely a lot more to do with that than I would say back then with like a Rough Riders or something like that.
Well, because then I think it was a big part of it was like the subversiveness,
right?
Which is like just in finally getting around to reading Trisha Rose Black Noise.
Yeah.
And just like how hip hop has been co-opted by the mainstream, but it also is a voice from the outside of the mainstream. So it's simultaneously those things,
right,
when it's really good.
Right.
But Drake, I feel like he's just in the he's like the multinational corporation of rap. Like he's
the Koch brothers.
Yeah. So it's like, so he doesn't have that edge. Like there's no movement around Drake.
Right.
But
yeah, that's pretty interesting though. Like thinking about that now. Like I wonder how many, like if you were to take that sort of marketing element away from a lot of these like albums, like which ones would still like remain sort of culturally relevant or be that classic.
Yeah, but can something even be culturally relevant without the marketing behind it? Right? It's like these things are so wrapped up. The sound and the image and the persona are all so wrapped up. It's like you can't separate them. You can't take one from the other. Yeah.
Right.
Shit.
Damn. Yeah.
Shit. But all right. So do we have any takeaways? Or are we just leaving it on more fucking questions?
I mean, I think that like my biggest takeaway is that this is all subjective. I mean, there's like, I think that as an informed listener, like, I think that there are like elements that you should take into consideration that you may not take into consideration. It's just, you know, shit is just out, and so you're listening to it because it's out there. I think in that sense, like, we could have like, I think we can have like more stringent requirements on what we consider or what we deem a classic. But ultimately it is a subjective sort of thing, and I don't know. And then, but you fucking me up too, because now it's like, how subjective is it if it's like marketed to you in a certain way, and it's just like you thinking that you really fucking with this, but but you just been inundated. So I don't know.
But my main thing is that for all the like fear mongering that there is about coming from the older heads about, oh shit, in 10 years from now they might be bumping Little Pump or whatever, it's like, so far through this discussion I've kind of realized that so far I think we've gotten the shit right. I like I said, I made the point about the snap music and shit. I think that, that's a really good point.
I think that a lot of cats are, you know, a lot of these younger kids, teenagers and shit are, you know, fucking with it because it's fun and everything like that. But the real shit is gonna always prevail, you know? And so that's why cats are like, oh, you know, 17-year-olds are saying like, damn is a classic to them, or, you know, whatever, right? Because it's like, that's some real shit ultimately. And I think that's what artists should be focused on. If you're gonna, you know, create a body of work, you know, just do some real shit, and you might have a chance of creating a classic.
All right, that's a good spot to end. Fuck. What is anything?
Now that you mention it, yeah.
What is anything?